Thank you for having me again. The governmental claim to investigate the killing of peaceful protesters from this week only and ignoring the 800 plus victims who died since October 2019 is just a reflection of the governmental attempt to buy time in order to ignore the wider problem, which are the demands and the reasons why we witnessed a popular uprising rejecting the sectarian politics in Iraq's state institutions, poor public services, from healthcare to education, youth unemployment, and the presence of militias in Iraq's everyday life. Now, this time-buying strategy is similar to the government's attempt in naming a new prime minister and cabinet from Jan until May this year, whilst leaving the same political parties and the same ethno-sectarian quota and the same militias that are indulging through Iraq's extreme corruption in the public sector. However, to be fair, and on the other hand, and to be fair to the entire picture here, this is most probably the first time that the Iraqi government is publicly confessing that the protesters were killed at the hands of the Iraqi security forces since the outbreak of October 2019 protests. Because the Iraqi government usually used to blame it on a third party, as they like to call it. And they continued to overuse the term third party to the extent that it was heavily picked by online sarcasm and political media comedy and irony. And that third-party term today is argued by most Iraqis that it's in reference to the militias, whom are mostly the armed wings of the big political parties and most probably supported and aligned with the pro-Iran interest group camp in Iraq. Right. Considering that the protest movement's discourse, of course, was heavily focused on Iran's hegemonic and expansionist intervention in Iraq.
I wonder how much do you think will change going forward under Kadhimi, right? You mentioned, of course, that there's been that positive move about at least now the government admitting that there have been protesters killed at the hands of security forces, et cetera. But Al-Kadhimi, made, from what I've understood, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, the Iranians a bit uncomfortable because he's a bit more pro-U.S., seemingly at least. That's what's being told and reported. Do you think that there is more promise in Al-Kadhimi to fix things?
It's very difficult to expect a lot of changes. Kadhimi, after all, despite being a little bit different from his predecessors, he's still a prominent member of that same political class that people protested against. He was the chief of the intelligence of the very same government that attacked and killed peaceful protesters. The Iraqi uprising, October uprising, challenged the entire political order, and that's an order that is managed and militarized by political and religious parties that are utilizing the country's communal diversity into an ethno-sectarian fragmentation in order to overshadow the theft of Iraq's public money and yearly budget and the continuous corruption. So, of course, it would also be protected by foreign and regional power players who share certain common interests with those political groups. Therefore, that political establishment and its militant and regional network will not easily give up to the youth protest movement, right, which is posing a threat to their organizational and institutional existence. Some of the political parties in today's Iraq started as a militia and then transformed into a political party to elect itself in the elections, and now it holds ministries and public departments. Referring back to the third-party term, third-party term, who weren't wearing uniforms of the security forces, who were killing peaceful protesters from, street alleys and on top of the rooftops of the buildings. A lot of them are from the armed wings of those political parties who are trying to, protect the political establishment that they're controlling. Now, of course, changing the cabinet and prime ministers for the past year due to the pressure of the protesters is, of course, a symbolic achievement. And you and I have discussed this months ago. Yeah. And it has to be acknowledged, just like pushing this new government to change its discourse from the killing of protesters being conducted by the so-called third party to finally admitting that it's the security forces is also another step forward. But that doesn't solve Iraq's drastic long-term economic insecurity and environmental issues, right? Yeah. Prime Minister Kadhimi himself claimed that his government cannot be responsible for the actions of his predecessors. But therefore, that means he must act and handle issues that have more long-term instead of short-term impacts. So instead of arresting 2 or 3 police officers, whom are still not identified, by the way, to the public, so we don't even know how true that is, they have to restructure the leadership of the armed and police forces and ensure it's free of all party politics and in particular of the muhafasa, as we call it, which is the ethno-sectarian quota group.
Zeidon, I wonder, who benefits from this continuous, just chaos, right, and instability? Because we've just seen constant political instability of recent, right, in Iraq, in the sense that, with these protests and with the issues not being addressed, and then, this change in government, and it took a significant amount of time, as, of course, you've already alluded to. I wonder, do you think we're finally entering into a period at least of political stability, however imperfect, of course, this political system is, to at least be able to do something and to possibly address the protesters' demands?
Yeah, well, the destabilization that comes after the protest movement is just, it's a natural reaction from the same political class. They either try to do it politically or they try to do it indirectly through those militias. Right, so the government can't be very, Iraq, despite the corruption and the militant presence in the Iraqi government and on the Iraqi streets, it's still a democracy, right? It's publicly a democracy. There's elections every 4 years, so they have to at least act according to a democratic side. They can't admit that they actually went out on the streets and they're arresting and killing peaceful protesters. But what they're trying to do is they're trying to do the classical accusations to the protesters that those protesters are being funded by foreign agendas that want to destabilize Iraq. And they try to use that unity rhetoric that we have to protect Iraq from any external interventions. We have to keep the stability, as if the Iraqi stability today was offering the right public services, as if it was offering them the right healthcare, education, security. And people are not buying that anymore. It's the same accusations that activists used to receive when they tried to oppose Saddam Hussein's regime. They used to accuse them, for being puppets to Iran or puppets to Israel or puppets to any other country or neighboring countries that disagreed with Saddam's interests. This government is doing the same thing. Whenever you stand up against this government, they would either claim that you're ISIS sleeping cells. It doesn't mean that there aren't any ISIS sleeping cells. There are, of course, but it's just those classical prepared and ready accusations to the protesters, whom, again, are threatening the political order of that political establishment.
Just before I let you go, Zeidon, I also wanted to broach this recent foreign trip that Al-Kadhimi took, right? So he went to Tehran as well, and he met Iranian officials, including the supreme leader as well. It is important, isn't it? I mean, as much as, of course, we talk about Iranian interference, influence, however we want to term it, within Iraq, it's important for Iraq to have good relations with, obviously, all of its neighbors, and secondly, even regional countries, right? And and take a more independent stance. Does this sort of thing achieve that? Where, do you think Al-Kadhimi has more of a chance of possibly taking steps towards doing that?
Yeah, well, first of all, of course, it is very important for Iraq and any other country in the world to have very good and peaceful and cooperative relations with their neighbors. Iraq should have great relationships, whether it be with Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait, and other neighboring countries. Yeah. But as long as that relationship doesn't cost them their sovereignty, right? The issue with Iraq and Iran is not because they're too close. It's just because Iran is too involved in Iraq. Iran's presence, in a very good example is Zarif, right? Zarif, the foreign minister of Iran. When he visited Iraq a few weeks ago, I think a week and a half ago, he was meeting almost over 10 officials. He met the head of the PMF, he met the Speaker of the Parliament, he met the Prime Minister, he met the President, he met the Chief of the Judiciary Court, he met politicians from different political parties in the Parliament. Those are not regular meetings of a foreign minister who visits a country. Usually the normal diplomatic protocol is if a foreign minister comes, he either meets the foreign minister or he might even meet the head of the state if he's lucky. Just like Kadhimi did. He met a few officials, but the main purpose of the visit is for him to meet the supreme leader of Iran and the president of Iran. Yeah. But we would never imagine a foreign minister of Iraq traveling to Tehran and meeting as many Iranian officials as Zarif did in Iraq. So here's the issue. Yes, we have to maintain a good relationship with Iran, but we also have to balance a relationship which ensures the economic and the political sovereignty of Iraq. The military vulnerable Iraq is a post-2003 Iraq which had its army disbanded and a very not protected borders.